Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Dr. Elise Moran. Tonight, we're walking the sand at Somerton Beach, Adelaide, on the morning of December 1, 1948, where a man was found, neat as a photograph, without a name. For decades, his body was a catalogue of small, deliberate puzzles, labels removed from his clothes, a tightly rolled scrap of paper saying Tamám Shud tucked into a secret pocket, a copy of the Rubaiyat with its final page torn out, and an odd string of letters penciled into the back cover. It's a case that keeps giving new evidence and new questions in equal measure.
Daniel here. Good to be with you, Elise. The Somerton man is the kind of case that sits in a historian's mind like a splinter. You can't leave it alone. For years, it was mainly stories and inquest transcripts, a well-dressed man, no ID, an autopsy that hinted at poisoning but couldn't name an agent, and a funeral under the descriptor unknown man. And then, much later, science offered a new route, DNA from hairs embedded in a plaster death mask. That opened the possibility of a name, but not, crucially, a full story.
Right, let's begin slowly. Picture the morning. Around 6:30 a.m, a jockey trainer named John Lyons finds a man propped against the seawall, legs extended, feet crossed, one arm slightly bent. The body looked too tidy to be accidental, shoes well polished, clothes neat, no obvious signs of a struggle, no identification. The first curious detail, almost all the clothing labels were cut out. Why would someone meticulously remove labels and yet leave other traces? It's the small decisions that keep pulling you back.
Yeah, and the personal effects are almost as telling as what's missing. In his pockets they found a used bus ticket to Somerton Beach, an unused second-class rail ticket to Henley Beach, a pack of chewing gum, mismatched cigarette brands in a packet, combs, matches, small, ordinary things. But no wallet, no identification, no hat. The lack of a hat in 1948 Australia is itself noticeable. Those ordinary items are the scaffolding we use to build hypotheses: spycraft, heartbreak, drift, suicide. But none of them do the heavy lifting alone.
Exactly. The autopsy is another layer. Performed early that December, it found an otherwise athletic, well-nourished man, about 5'11", in his early to mid-40s. Internally, organs were congested, liver, brain, kidneys, and the spleen was markedly enlarged, roughly 3 times normal size. The stomach contained remnants of a meat pie eaten a few hours before death, but standard toxicology of the time didn't detect common poisons. Pathologists at the time considered the possibility of a rare cardiac-acting poison, digitalis or strophanthine, were floated, but the tests of the 1940s simply couldn't detect everything.
And that's an important point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially with mid-20th century toxicology. The coroner's inquest in 1949 essentially concluded the cause was likely poisoning, but could not say whether it was suicide or homicide. So already we have a medical picture that suggests chemical interference without the tools to say what. That uncertainty is the seedbed for every conspiracy and every humane theory that followed.
Let's follow the physical trail. Months after the autopsy, the pathologist, John Cleland, re-examined the body and found something missed earlier, a small, tightly rolled scrap of paper hidden in a fog pocket of the trousers. On it, printed, were the words Tamám Shud, Persian for "it is finished." That scrap matched a torn final page from a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a translation of Persian quatrains. When police publicized this, it pushed the case into a different register: literature, symbolism, and yes, a code in the book's back cover.
And that book is a narrative turn. An aesthetic object becomes evidence. A local businessman later came forward saying a copy of the Rubaiyat had appeared in the back seat of his Hillman Minx, parked near the beach around the time of the man's death. The edition was a New Zealand printing. The final page with Tamám Shud was torn out. The tear matched the scrap found in the Somerton man's pocket. Small matches like this are electrifying. They connect the corpse to an object, and through the object to people.
Which brings us to the phone number and the woman, Jessica Thompson, often called Jestyn. Inside the back cover, someone had left a telephone number and a string of letters that looked like code. The number led to a nurse who lived just a few hundred metres from the death site. When police showed her a plastic cast of the Somerton man's face, she reportedly appeared disturbed, nearly fainting. She denied any relationship with the dead man, but her reaction stoked imaginations for decades. It's one of those emotional flashes in a cold file.
And for years, people read a novel in that flash lover, secret child, wartime liaison. The Rubaiyat itself is a book associated with love and fatalism. Its final line reading, "It is finished," feels like a theatrical epigraph to a suicide or the end of a relationship. But we must be careful. Assertions that Jestyn's son was the Somerton man's child turned out to be false. DNA testing in the 2010s showed no genetic link between Robin Thompson's descendants and the Somerton man. So the human reaction remained emotionally potent but scientifically ambiguous.
Let's bring in the suitcase. Mid-January 1949, railway staff opened an unclaimed brown suitcase that had been left at Adelaide Railway Station since November 30. There's a date match with the night before the body was discovered. The contents were a mix of clothing and tools: pyjamas, a red dressing gown, underwear, a stencil brush, a shortened table knife, scissors, and, intriguingly, items labelled with the name Keen, T. Keen. For years, that Keen tag was a mysterious stray. Later genealogical work would make that tag suddenly less random, but at the time it fed the idea that the man had tried to scrub identity and yet left clues.
Yes, and the tools, stencil brush, screwdriver, cut-down knife, hint at a practical trade. That dovetails with the later identification candidates who had technical professions. Some of the early spy theories pointed to those tools as signs of clandestine work, but they're also consistent with an electrical engineer or instrument maker. The suitcase also raised the question, why check luggage and then let it sit unclaimed? Did he plan to retrieve it? Did he intend to leave town with just what was on him? We don't know.
So then there's the cipher, the string of mysterious letters penciled faintly in the book's back. Popular transcriptions vary slightly, but they're roughly WRGOABABD, MLIAOI, WTBIMPANETP, MLIABOIAQC, ITTMTSAMSTGAB. Everyone who looks at them says the same. It isn't obviously English, there are a few vowels, patterns repeat, and parts appear crossed out. Cryptanalysts from police to amateurs have tried everything: substitution ciphers, acrostics, one-time pad theories, and mnemonic first-letter hypotheses. None have produced a consensus, peer-reviewed solution. It remains stubbornly opaque.
Right. Some people leap to the one-time pad idea because that would neatly explain irreducibility. But there's no pad, and the structure doesn't sit neatly with typical OTP groups. The acrostic, or first-letter mnemonic, is plausible. Each letter could be the initial of a word in a phrase, a verse, or a list. But exhaustive matches with the Rubaiyat and other common texts have failed to convince. Other options: random notes, initials of people or places, or a private shorthand that would mean nothing to anyone but the writer. In short, the cipher is a Rorschach. People project. As historians and forensic scientists, we have to be patient and methodical.
Let's pause there. I want to ask you, Daniel, spy or no spy? Given the timing, late 1948, early Cold War, and the apparent label removal, the cigarette brand switch, the Cipher. How persuasive is the espionage frame? Be blunt.
Good question, Elise. Be blunt, okay. The spy narrative is culturally irresistible. Timing and certain tradecraft-like details, labels removed, no ID, odd code, fit what people imagine spies do. But the evidence is thin on institutional links. No declassified file has placed this man in an intelligence network, and the cipher lacks hallmarks of professional agency ciphers. The identification as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker, doesn't rule out espionage, but it weakens the default assumption that state actors were involved. I'd say plausible but unproven, and increasingly strained given genealogical evidence.
Plausible but unproven. And then there's a more domestic narrative. Jilted lover, romantic tragedy. The Rubaiyat, the phone number to a nurse, Jestyn's reaction. Those fit a sorrowful human story. Add Webb's personal history, if he is Webb, separated from his wife Dorothy around 1947, and travel toward Adelaide perhaps to find her. It's tempting to read the Tamám Shud scrap as a final epigraph, a private punctuation. That narrative feels human and believable, but it still doesn't explain the cipher nor the label removal. So again, incomplete.
Exactly. Human lives are messier than tidy stories. If Webb separated from his wife and vanished, a suicide narrative becomes plausible. A man in emotional crisis, a fatal dose administered to himself, a Rubaiyat as a kind of emblem or note. The physiological autopsy findings, congested organs and enlarged spleen, could be consistent with a cardiac-acting poison that wasn't detectable by 1940s tests. But that still leaves open why someone would remove labels and why a coded set of letters would be left. Unless the cipher was for himself, Morse code of memory, or something else entirely.
We should also cover the public spectacle, his burial, the death mask, and the long, cold case trajectory. After the inquest, he was buried in West Terrace Cemetery on June 14, 1949, under a stone that reads, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach, first deck 1948. Before burial, a plaster death mask was made by Paul Lawson. Decades later, hairs trapped in that plaster became crucial. It's a reminder, even those mundane preservation practices, making a death mask, can become a lifeline for future science."
Yes, that detail bridges eras of forensic capability. Fast forward, in recent years, Professor Derek Abbott obtained hairs embedded in the mask, and the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA confirmed maternal line European ancestry from them. Then, in 2021, police exhumed the body to obtain more DNA. By mid-2022, a team using forensic genetic genealogy built an extensive tree, about 4,000 individuals, and converged on a single candidate, Carl Charles Webb, born November 16, 1905, in Footscray. The connection isn't merely genetic. Family photographs, divorce records, and occupational matches made the tentative identification more coherent.
Let me stop you, because that Keen tag in the suitcase fits here in an almost cinematic way. Webb had a sister, Frida, who married a Thomas Keen. So the T. Keen labels that once looked like an orphan clue suddenly have a mundane family explanation. The technical tools in the suitcase fit Webb's supposed trade as an electrical engineer and instrument maker, and relatives who'd never known the missing man were contacted. Some provided DNA that strengthened the case. It's the moment where disparate strands knit together. But
hang on. It's not the end. Even with the Webb identification, key questions remain. What poisoned him? Who wrote the cipher and why? And was his death self-inflicted or arranged? Some independent investigators argue the hair might need direct corroboration against DNA from the exhumed remains. Abbott and colleagues deny that the hair is contaminated. The position is that the hair's context in the plaster is conclusive. The police and coroner still had to make a legal declaration as of mid-2020s, so scientifically persuasive is not always legally definitive. The final official seal had not been universally applied.
Right, and that gap between scientific persuasion and legal confirmation is important to explain. The research team described the evidence as beyond reasonable doubt, which is a strong phrase in forensic contexts, but not absolute mathematical certainty. And this distinction matters because the case has been a magnet for lovers of neat answers. We need to be comfortable with the idea that naming the man, if it is indeed Webb, doesn't close the book on motive, method, or relationship dynamics.
Let's talk about the cipher again in that light. If the Somerton man was an ordinary engineer in personal crisis, what are the plausible explanations for the letters? 3 options seem sensible. A mnemonic, first letters of words meaningful to him, a private shorthand, maybe initials of people or places, or simply experimentations with letters, a doodle. People like the one-time pad idea because it sounds dramatic, but there's no pad. There's also the possibility that the cipher never had a receiver. It was personal, not meant to be decoded by an intelligence handler.
Yes, and that's a humbling point for armchair cryptanalysts. A message that no one else can receive is still meaningful to the sender. We also need to correct some common misconceptions that have circulated. The code has not been definitively solved. Jestyn's son was not the Somerton man. The government didn't quietly know the identity for decades and withhold it. And the Rubaiyat, while significant, was not some rare spy text. Its translations were quite popular. These clarifications help us avoid spinning fanciful narratives that the evidence simply doesn't support.
I'll add one more misconception to that list, that the exhumation solved everything. It didn't. It provided DNA that made a compelling identification possible, but it didn't tell us why he died or the meaning of the cipher. Scientific advances give us better sights on certain features, identity, maternal line, probable family connections, but they don't necessarily translate into motives or narratives. The Somerton man's story is now as much about what science can't yet say as what it can.
Let's get back to humanity for a moment. If he was Carl Webb, he had family, parents, siblings. There were divorce records and notes of separation from his wife Dorothy. Relatives later produced photographs showing a man whose features resembled the death mask. Imagine being those family members contacted decades later. Pride, confusion, grief. Scientists restored a name to a grave marker engraved with unknown Nan, and that shift is emotional and ethical. It reminds us these aren't just artefacts, they're people's kin.
Exactly. There's a moral weight in unmasking the dead. Families who'd lived with an absence suddenly learn a new set of facts, incomplete though they are. And remember, historical context matters. Post-war Australia in 1948 was changing. Cold War anxieties, shifting social norms, and a culture that might prompt a private man to be secretive about certain things. That context colours our interpretations, but it doesn't substitute for evidence.
We should also acknowledge the enduring power of the Tamám Shud phrase itself. It means it is finished. There's an irony. The note was both an end and the beginning of a long mystery. It's become a cultural emblem. People read it as suicide note, final statement, or poetic flourish. But it could equally have been a deliberate misdirection, or something the man carried as a talisman. We mustn't force a symbolic reading where a more banal explanation suffices.
Adopted symbolism or projected meaning can mislead. The Rubaiyat had cultural currency as a book about fate and mortality. Gifting copies and inscribing verses was common. The presence of the book could be romantic, performative, or simply a coincidence. Our impulse to create narrative closure is strong, but the evidence says partial answers, not total narratives. The cipher resists closure.
The autopsy leaves the precise poison unknown, and the family connections, while illuminating, don't narrate motive.
Let's bring the conversation to contemporary methods. Forensic genetic genealogy, building that 4,000-person tree from a hair sample and converging on a candidate, represents a leap in capability. Colleen Fitzpatrick and her team used public databases and traditional genealogical sleuthing combined with DNA. It's a reminder that modern techniques can reach back decades, but with that power comes responsibility, privacy concerns, consent of databases, and limits of what DNA can actually tell us about choices, beliefs, and secrets.
Good point. Genetic genealogy is potent for naming the unnamed, but it's not a moral compass. It tells you kinship, not intent. And there's also the caveat that the methodology relies on the availability and accuracy of public and commercial databases. It can unearth relatives who didn't expect to be part of an investigation. That's why legal and ethical frameworks matter. In the Somerton man case, the researchers were careful, and relatives were contacted before public announcements. Still, it's a technique that changes how cold cases are solved and how families are found.
Now, let's not forget the critics. Some independent investigators question the sufficiency of the hair evidence and ask for direct body hair corroboration. Others worry about possible tampering with the skull historically. Those are fair scientific questions. The research team argues the contextual evidence of the hair trapped in the plaster is strong, but until the coroner issues a legal ruling, debate will continue. Good science welcomes critique. Mystery survives precise scrutiny.
And that's part of why we keep returning to Somerton. Its resistance to tidy explanations makes it a perfect case study in the limits and strengths of forensic and historical methods. Even with a likely name, many of the most human questions, why did he go to Somerton Beach that night? Did he seek Jestyn? Did he intend to die? Remain unsettled. We're left with an identified man and an unfinished story.
Before we wrap, Daniel, tell me one thing that still haunts you about this file, one small detail that never leaves you.
I keep coming back to Jestyn's reaction to the plaster bust. That moment, a clearly emotional, physical response, is haunting because it's human and raw in an otherwise bureaucratic file. It suggests a private knot of feeling that official records can't fully untie. Even if she didn't know him, that reaction tells us someone somewhere recognized something, and that recognition stayed hidden. It's a poignant reminder that facts and feelings live in different archives.
I feel the same pull to that moment. For me, it's the cipher, the idea that someone wrote a string of letters we've tried to coax meaning from for decades. It's such a small object, and yet it has generated careers, books, documentaries, and endless speculation. The fact that modern cryptanalysis and AI haven't turned it into a neat answer is, for me, a potent testament to human opacity.
So where does that leave us? We can tidy a few things. There's a highly persuasive identification to Carl Charles Webb, supported by genetic genealogy and family photographs. We have plausible occupational and family links that explain odd items like the Keen labels, and forensic signs point to poisoning without a named agent. We cannot yet say definitively why he died, whether he was murdered or took his own life, what the cipher means, or the exact relationship, if any, he had with Jestyn. Those gaps make the case still unanswered.
And that's the honest finish. Tamám Shud. It is finished. Yet the case resists finality. Science can return a name. It can reshape legal records and bring closure to families. It cannot, at least not yet, recover an interior life or an unequivocal motive. For listeners who love puzzles, this is frustrating. For those who care about people, it's a reminder that resolving identity is only the first step towards understanding a life.
We'll leave you with one practical thing. If you're curious and want to read more, the media coverage from ABC, The Guardian, and the PR releases by the research team provide timelines, images, and details we discussed. The Wikipedia entry is a useful synthesis with references. But remember, when you read speculation on forums and in documentaries, weigh claims against documented sources. The Somerton man rewards curiosity, but it punishes certainty.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of Still Unanswered. I'm Elise Moran.
And I'm Daniel Hargrove. Take care of each other and the little details. They matter. Good night.